Hi, welcome in another part 10 of the Quasar training. Pierre speaking here. This will be a very short part, or at least I hope probably the shortest. It's on documenting your design and generating the docs. I probably don't have to tell you that documentation is important, but nobody likes to do that. Or I barely ever met a person who'd like to create documentation for software. So in Quasar, there is a few features that were put to maybe simplify it a bit, or at least to streamline it and to have it unified, such that people could profit from basic but very essential documentation that one can attach. So here we speak about documenting the design itself, but since the design kind of reflects the system for which you make your OPC-UA server, and also so much actually comes out of design, because design propagates into configuration, to device logic, into address space, and many other things. Therefore, attaching a bit of documentation in the sensitive places actually has an edge. All right, so what's to remark is there is a special XML element in the design that serves the purpose of documentation. So you can find this, or you can see this in the content model. It's simply called documentation. So you can insert it almost anywhere. So by class, by cache variable, by config entry. But this information will be, depending on where you put it, will be propagated into different places, as we will shortly see. Now, a few simple general rules. So we do recommend that you use it, and preferably use it everywhere where it makes sense. But don't be redundant. For instance, if you have a class motor like we have in this training, don't document motor saying it's a motor. One can get that from the name. Try to say something one level of detail deeper. So saying it's about motor, this class corresponds to motor type A, B, and C, and it monitors and it communicates with the motor controller, or something like this. 2-3 phrases, but just beyond something which is obvious. Be concise. If necessary, put a reference to external documentation. So of course, this inline documentation will not serve as a manual, like a printed book about something, but still it's very useful. And then a few ideas. So for instance, when documenting config entries and variables, so things that are then propagated into the configuration and into the address space, try to mention what's the unit of value, so that, for instance, rotation speed is represented in RPMs and voltage is in millivolts and like that. And then maybe mention how and when the value should be transferred, which means read and read and written. For instance, that the update rate is this and that, and say what happens when you write to given variable and things like that, very concisely. And note that configuration is something that almost all admins and control system designers and maybe end users will create. So that will, the documentation that you place will help those people in the process of making the configuration, preparing the configuration. So the overall user experience will be much higher. And now, when you put the documentation in the design, then you can generate, as of today, 2 part documentation. The first part is configuration schema documentation, which is useful for people deploying or maintaining your server. And the second one is address space documentation, which is useful for people who integrate your OPC-UA solution in the whole distributed control system. So a few small examples. So we talked about this motor class. So let's say I add documentation here and I say that this class covers motors of type A and B, whatever that is. Of course, has to relate to your particular example. Here, I'm just giving an example. So you see, it goes beyond something obvious, like this is a motor, but it's still concise and informational. Maybe I could, for instance, place here a link to what a motor A and motor B is. And remember, you can also use full HTML in this XML element. Then I have for instance, a config entry. And I say here it's a identifier, and this will be the information, since this propagates in the configuration for somebody making the configuration. So what could be the information relevant for a person writing the configuration? This should match the slot at which the motor is inserted, or whatever that is meaningful, such that the person knows where to obtain this identifier. Like a person takes a look at the hardware, or at the hardware plans, or electronic schematic, or whatever, and that they know that the number you should put as identifier corresponds to some information which is pre-prepared. Then, for instance, we have the cache variables, and you could say that for rotational speed, you could say that is expressed in RPMs. Okay? And you could say uncalibrated value. Calibrated value. Okay? And then you could say, I don't know what else would be important. I think those are really enough examples. Now let's see what it did actually. So I go into my OPC-UA server, and then I do generate config doc, and I open the file in documentation, config documentation, and there I find configuration documentation. It's missing, so it's a template, so this information comes from here. So look, at the top level of your design, you find something like project short name, so you could say it's a smart, I don't know, motor OPC-UA server, or whatever like that. It's something that is like a traditional short name. So for instance, the name that you would package your software as. And then I run it again, and voila, this is now completed. What I see is I have the information on which, since this is the config documentation, so I have the information on all XSD elements that are defined in the configuration schema. Of course, the names of the elements follow what you have in the design, but then look, you have a bit more of information which is relevant to configuration. So for instance, Quasar on its own puts the information on what are the value restrictions. So somebody creating this configuration file can actually know that for instance, the address must match this pattern, and that the identifier of motor is somewhere between 0 and 3. And that this is an enumeration refresh rate, but also whenever you see this doc in blue, this is the information you've put, right? So as you see, it's bound to, or you can profit from the information per class, per config entry, per cache variables, whatever that makes sense to you. So this is the config documentation. You can attach this file, this HTML file, to the distribute table of your OPC-UA server, such that it will aid those people to, like end users, sysadmins, designers, to actually deploy your software in production. Then we have another type. So apart from this one, we can do ASDoc, which stands for Address Space Documentation. So I can see what's inside this documentation address space doc. And there I find OPC-UA address space documentation, and I also find classes, but then I get the information what's actually in the address space, and whatever is address space per class, I can see what's the type, what's the thing from Quasar that it was actually made, cache variable, what's the access level, and you also have documentation, for instance, the rotational speed expressed in rotations per minute, and its uncalibrated value. And so on and so forth. I hope you get the pattern, so we don't really have to spend more time on this aspect. So the takeaways are, please be nice to people who will use your product. Just try to help them a little bit. Just attach those 1, 2, 3 phrases per class, per cache variable, per config entry, such that the overall aspect of how user-friendly your product is much better. So thank you, and hope to see you in the next part.